Last week, we started together a teaching series on generosity. We decided that it was important for us as we closed out this year that we teach through our giving liturgy in this teaching series called A Generous Kingdom. That here, right in the middle of our service, every single Sunday when we gather together, we do this giving liturgy as a statement of identity. And we realized it was very important for us to actually stop and go through and talk about why we do this and the convictions we hold about generosity, about money, about possessions, and about stuff. And it was valuable to us. And we started this last week and we shared this. And I just want to say, I understand that so many of us come from different backgrounds, different experiences. So many of us have experienced hurt or manipulation or coercion. When we talk about God and money, it can get pretty tricky because a lot of us have had negative experiences attached to God and money. And our heart is this, not that we would ever manipulate or coerce anyone. We just actually recognize that the scriptures teach us that the way we steward our money is central to how we worship God. So we actually have to be a church community that talks about money, that talks about possessions, that talks about how we steward our finances, because there is no way to be a faithful follower of Jesus until we submit this part of our life to him and his heart. And that's what we feel convicted to do, to talk together as a church family. What is God's heart for money and possessions and stuff so that we can steward our life that way? And again, like I said last week, anyone that has ever experienced pain or manipulation at the hands of the church or of a religious leader around finances, I just apologize on their behalf. That is not what you are going to experience here. But what we are going to do is be radical in our submission to Jesus and willing to follow his heart no matter what it may be. And last week we mentioned this, but and I want to say this, if you weren't with us last week, I would really encourage you to hop online and listen to that teaching. Everything I'm about to share today and over the next 4 weeks really hinges on that teaching. Last week we talked about having an identity of stewards, understanding that our central identity as followers of Jesus is as stewards. We're not the king, we're not the authority, we're not the ones who get to decide. We're actually the ones who are stewarding what belongs to Jesus. Our whole life, all of our money, all of our possessions is actually his. And so our responsibility is, how do we live in response to him as stewards and not as our own authorities? And until we really get that identity, generosity is always going to be an issue, because it's only out of the heartbeat of a steward that we really get to live in the radical generosity that God has pronounced for us. And even this whole concept of liturgy, why do we do this? If you didn't grow up in a Lutheran or an Anglican or a Catholic background where high church is a little more foreign to you, like me, maybe you grew up in a pretty modern form of church and you get around liturgy and you're like, why do we do this? I remember the first time I visited my wife's Lutheran church when we were dating, and I'm like, this is the weirdest thing in the world, right? But what I've come to learn over time is that liturgy is actually spiritual formation. We practice forms of liturgy because liturgy is spiritual formation. When we do these things together, it actually helps shape us into the image of Jesus, just like worship is. So that is just a reminder of why we value this. And the part of this liturgy that we're looking through today says this: to keep everything to myself and to give without sacrifice, to build my kingdom, is the way of the world that you cannot abide in. But generosity is the way of those who call Christ their Lord, who love him with freed hearts and serve him with renewed minds. And in many ways, this passage of scripture is taken, this liturgy is taken centrally out of Matthew 6. Michael already read this, but let me read it to you again. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. You cannot serve both God and money. This is a challenging passage. And I just even admit to you today, what I have to share with you is a convicting message. But it's not because I come to you self-righteous or arrogant. I come to you as a convicted man myself. Listen, I know for many of us, we read passages like this, and I think instantaneously what happens is we feel judged, right? We feel the weight of this passage. So what we do is we kind of push it away and try to minimize what it's actually trying to say to us. And can I just encourage you this morning to drop your arm and not stand at a distance from this passage, to be okay saying, Jesus, whatever you mean by this, I want to follow you. I don't want to talk around the teachings of Jesus. I don't want to find loopholes to not have to be obedient to Jesus. Whatever his challenge is, no matter how convicting it is, no matter what it means for what I need to change in my life, I want to be obedient to Jesus. And I long for that for you as well. And so I even encourage you today, sorry about my voice. I encourage you today to not dismiss this passage, but to let it come and challenge you at our very being. You know, it's interesting where it starts, isn't it? Where Jesus says, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth. Be concerned about treasures in heaven. And it forces you to ask the question, okay, is it saving wrong? Is having a retirement account wrong? Are these things wrong? And I think that's a fair question to ask if we want to take this passage seriously. And what I want to encourage you in is I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. I don't think he's talking about, in fact, the scriptures and Proverbs and several other places would talk about wisely use your money, save, be able to be somebody who has resources. I don't think what Jesus is talking about is being upset with you that you have a savings account or being upset with you that you're setting aside for retirement. I think what Jesus is talking about is something far more significant than that. It's easy for us to cheapen this to to-do lists when Jesus actually isn't talking about to-do lists. Jesus is talking about the condition of your heart. See, what Jesus is actually saying is he's saying, you should trust me more than you trust your job. You should trust me more than you trust your bank account. You should trust me more than you trust your savings account. You should trust me no matter what. And Jesus is after the affiliation, the affection, and the allegiance of your heart. And I love this line. I mean, I hate this line because it's so challenging, but I understand what he says. You cannot serve both God and money. You cannot serve both God and money. You know, and Jesus in this moment actually uses an interesting word for money, and a word that isn't used all of the time. But Jesus is talking about something very specific. He actually says, you cannot serve both God and mammon. Both God and mammon. Mammon is an Aramaic word that means the treasure in which you trust. The treasure in which you trust. And I just want you to sit with this for a second, to recognize what Jesus is doing. He's saying, you cannot serve God and serve a money and a possession and a treasure that you trust in. And I just want to tell you, as 21st century Americans, this needs to deeply challenge us. Because for us, we have subtly made mammon an acceptable part of our spiritual life. We have subtly, because mammon is so deeply associated with the American dream, have found a way to minimize the power of this evil and have accepted it as a part of our lives. And we need to, as followers of Jesus, allow him to challenge us and say, you cannot serve both God and mammon. You cannot serve both God and greed. You cannot say you trust God and actually trust your bank account. They are two opposing forces of one another. I would say this, mammon is defined literally as the treasure in which you put your trust, but mammon is also more than that. We also learn from the character of the heart of Jesus and how the scriptures speak to this idea and how church fathers taken us, that mammon wasn't just a concept, that mammon was a spiritual force in the world. Listen, one of the things that we believe as followers of Jesus is that we live in a spiritual world full of real spiritual powers, heavenly powers and dark powers. We actually believe there is an enemy who is against us. There is a spiritual world that we live in. And what Jesus is indicating isn't that there is just an essence to greed. He's actually indicating that there is a spirit and a demonic agenda to this world called greed, and it is after you. And we need to recognize that we live in this kind of spiritual world. Mammon is the spirit of greed and the demonic agenda and the idol of materialism that is the God of our age. There is no other God like the God of mammon in our world. No other God like the God of stuff, possessions, more, greed, having status and ownership. This is a spiritual agenda that we need to recognize. Mammon is significant. And if we don't stop and realize the warning of Jesus, we become susceptible to be the people who tolerate mammon as a false idol in our lives. Listen to this quote. I read a book by a guy named Douglas Jones called Dismissing Jesus. And he says this in this book. I want you to hear this. You cannot serve both God and mammon. Jesus didn't deny that money was a god. That god even has a name, Mammon. Jesus affirmed mammon as the sole serious competitor to the Trinity. Jesus understood the antithesis or contrast between God's way and mammon's way as the most fundamental direction in all of life and history. He didn't divide the world into left versus right, liberal versus conservative, envious versus entrepreneur, Christian versus Muslim. Jesus didn't make mammon just a side temptation for the few like we do. Typical Christians tend to shrink mammon into one of its many small idols, alongside Apocryphan sexuality, Hephanesian technology, Bacchalian passion, Promethean science, Gaian mysticism, and the Levian state and others. I'm convinced that he did that just to sound smart, by the way. I read that passage and I go, I get it, Doug, you got a PhD. Thank you for making me feel terrible about myself. But just keep following him, right? For Jesus, mammon wasn't the idol among many equals. He singled it out as the direct competitor to God. He never contrasted the idols of sexuality or knowledge or the earth in such a stark opposition to God. Jesus never said you can't serve sexuality in God or knowledge in God, though these were idols too. He only said you cannot serve mammon and God. I think that needs to cause us to step back. Friends, listen, as faithful followers of Jesus, I think in some ways I could just close my sermon here. I'm a preacher, so I'm not going to. But I think in some ways I could close this sermon here and go, you need to go wrestle with this. Because part of being a faithful follower of Jesus is actually willing to hear the challenges of Jesus and going, okay, Lord, come and show me. Have I let greed become too much a part of my life? Have I let greed impact me negatively? Have I actually submitted to the way of mammon and I haven't even been able to realize it? Part of what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus is that we respond to the difficulty and to the challenge of his teaching. Jesus' radical love is so real, but so is his challenge. And we have to receive that. And this morning, from this, I just have a few simple thoughts for you. First is this. There is a spirit of greed that is after your heart. Take this as a warning. There is a supernatural, demonic spirit of greed that is all over this world, and it is after your heart. Isn't it interesting when Jesus talks about this passage, what he's talking about the condition of your heart, right? He says, if you let true light in, the eye is the window to the heart. You let true light in, you're going to be filled with light. But if you let darkness in, it's going to fill you with this incredible darkness. What's at stake, friends, is the condition of your heart. And we need to know that. And you know, this idea of mammon has captivated not only the literature of Christian fathers and historical authors, but there's actually a lot of paintings and renderings and ideas of this concept of mammon. And as I was preparing for this message, I found this picture literally called Mammon and His Slave, and it gripped me. And I wanted to show it to you. Because I thought, there's been times that's been me. And there's something about that picture that's so haunting. Where my response is, Jesus, may it never be so. May it never be so of me. May it never be so of our church. May we never bow to the false god of mammon. May we never be so caught with greed that we give our worship somewhere else. This picture captures the power of what's at stake. In my life, I haven't had many what I would call spiritual dreams. I actually long for more of them, dreams that I can say with certainty, I know were from God. I can tell you of two profound ones, and I want to tell you about one of them. When I was younger, Emily and I lived in Seattle, and I was a youth pastor, and we had this season where our youth ministry grew pretty rapidly. And because of that, I started to get invited to speak at different youth conferences and things like that. And probably for the first time in my life was any sense of notoriety or anybody knowing my name or anything like that. And I remember there was this night where I fell asleep and I had this dream. And it's so vivid. I can still see every detail of it. I was in this park. And I remember as I walked into this park, there was this machine. And the machine was beautiful. It was all gold, and it was steampunk-esque. That's the only way I can describe it. It had all of these different parts and mechanisms, and it was just this machine, and I was captivated by this machine. And as I went up to this machine, what I began to realize was that money was flowing all the way through this machine. It wasn't going anywhere. It was just circulating in and out. And as it looked like it was about to leave the machine, it would go right back into the machine. And I was just staring there, watching it. And I remember thinking, this is so beautiful. I was caught by how beautiful it was. And then I noticed out of the corner of my eye, there was a person down at the distance, at the far end of the machine, frantically trying to grab money out of the machine. And it was so interesting. As I looked at him, I started to experience this same desire. I started to long for the money that was in this machine. I remember looking at him and looking at the machine and seeing the money flowing. And literally I could feel greed rising up inside of me, this unsatiable desire to have what was in there. And suddenly I decided, I turned my eyes from him onto the machine, and I started to figure out how I could try to grab some of the money for myself. And as I started to try to grab the money, this figure that was in the distance started to run at me. It was terrifying. And I remember as he got closer, his face was deformed. I realized that this was a demonic thing. And he jumped at me. I woke up, I screamed. I woke my wife up screaming, terrified. And instantly, though, in my spirit, I knew the Lord was warning me. And he was saying, Phil, there is a spirit of greed that is after your life, and you have to be careful. There is a demonic agenda of you longing for things that are not yours. And if you are not careful, it will destroy you. I still carry that moment in my heart as a deep conviction and warning. Friends, I'm here to tell you the truth. There is a spirit of greed that is after your heart and your mind, and you cannot fall trap to it. God has something different for his people. But I love what this passage also helps us realize is that generosity is our activity of resistance in a world of greed. And see, that's what we need to see. We've minimized generosity. We make generosity a roller coaster of our emotions. I'm going to be generous when I feel like it. I'm going to be generous when I have a lot. And I'm not going to be generous when I don't feel like it. And I'm not going to be generous when I don't have a lot. And what we do is we make generosity the cycle of our own emotions, but it's meaningless in our lives. When what God actually intended was for generosity to be an active form of resistance. Friends, this is what you and we've talked about this a lot as a church. We live in a counterculture. Culture is going this way. We are going that way. We are constantly in acts of resistance in what it means to be followers of Jesus. And if I want to live as a faithful follower of Jesus, I can't leave generosity up to the equation of maybe when I feel like it. What I've realized is that I have to live in an active form of sustainable resistance all the time, or greed is going to have a way of manifesting itself in me. Let me tell you the truth. 21st century American materialism is too powerful for you. If you do not live in active resistance against it, it will destroy you. It will consume you. It will come after you, and it will win. It's not a joke. It is a powerful essence in our world. So you and I have to realize that part of the reason why we practice generosity is we set up a boundary around ourselves and say, I'm going to set up a boundary that greed doesn't get my heart. Greed doesn't get a place in me. Generosity becomes the way I live. There's so many passages that I could pull out and talk about generosity. I loved a few of these. Listen to Proverbs 14:31. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Listen to this one from Proverbs 22:9. The generous themselves will be blessed, for they will share their food with the poor. Friends, I could spend the next 2 hours quoting verse after verse after verse about God's heart for us to be generous. It's embedded in the scriptures, almost as true as anything else. What we need to recognize, though, is that what God is asking for us in generosity is not to live at the whims of our emotion, but to live in a form of active resistance that protects our hearts against greed. I'm going to share over today and over these next few weeks, I'm going to open up more about my own life and Emily and I's life, about how we steward our money, not to try to share anything about ourselves or try to make us seem better. In fact, I know that there are far more generous people than us. And I hesitate to do that because I believe the scriptures that say, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. There's something about generosity that was always meant to be in the secret place. But I also know that sometimes we need examples and we need people that are willing to talk about generosity out open in the public we can learn how to follow them. I want to share this with you. Emily and I have come to a decision that we are going to live in a base level of generosity that nothing can touch. Because we've realized we have to do this to protect the condition of our hearts. We have to set a base standard of generosity that says, my conviction is about being generous and nothing gets to touch it, right? We have a budget. We try to live by our budget. And guess what? If more expenses come in, you want to go get swallowed up, not our generosity. Our generosity doesn't get swallowed up. Our clothing budget gets swallowed up. Our saving budget gets swallowed up. Anything else gets swallowed up. But we have a baseline of generosity that is untouchable because we recognize we're weak. We recognize we're human. And without forming an active resistance against a culture of greed, we realize that greed has a way of dictating our hearts. And I want to tell you this. Greed doesn't just get you when you have enough. Greed gets you most of the time when you don't. And we need to be cautious. Emily and I'll just tell you, we have made a decision, no matter what happens, we will tithe. It's a conviction on our hearts that we give a certain percentage. We live in that with our church. Emily and I give, we support missionaries. We monthly support missionaries. Emily and I believe it's a conviction on our lives that we support the needy. So we give to multiple organizations. We actually take care of children through Compassion International. We support 2 kids through Compassion International. And then we have a set aside amount that is just open for the Lord to tell us whatever he wants to do. Every single month, we live in an active resistance to greed. And it's a conviction that we've made. And I want to challenge you. One of the practical things I want to challenge you with today is you should do that too. You should start somewhere, even if it's small, saying, here is an untouchable amount. Greed doesn't get the affection of my heart. The gospel gets the affection of my heart. Greed doesn't get the affection of my heart. The gospel gets the affection of my heart. We have to become those kinds of people that allow our lives. And let me tell you, the hope of my life is that if Jesus said, Phil, empty your bank account now and give it all, I would say yes. I admit to you, I don't know what I would do. I would wrestle with that like you would wrestle with that. But I tell you, at minimum, the desire of my heart, I want to be the kind of man that follows Jesus no matter what he says. We have to learn, I want you to get this, generosity is resistance. So it has to become a standard in our lives, or greed has a way of taking over. I love this quote by C.S. Lewis. If our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusements, etc., is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. If our charities do not all pinch or hamper us, I should say that they are too small. There ought to be things we should like to do and cannot do because our charitable expenditures exclude them. Man, that's convicting, but he's right. Let me tell you what I believe. God is not a God of poverty. Christians aren't called to a poverty mindset, and your future is not a future of poverty. I don't think a faithful Christian lives in a poverty mindset. I think we have a father who loves to bless. I think we have a father who loves to bless his kids. I think as a father, I understand that's part of how I steward my finances is to live in radical blessing towards my wife and my family and my friends. But I also recognize this. I have accepted a culture of mammon and I've made it normal. And I have compromised places in my own life, not because I want to live in a blessing, but because there is part of my heart that secretly bows to greed. And I just want all of my heart back. And I want all of your heart back. And I do love this quote by C.S. Lewis, that as Christians, there should be some things, yes, we could afford to do it, but I'd rather feed the poor. Yes, I could afford to do it, but I'd rather support a missionary. Yes, I could afford to do it, but I'd rather make my life count for eternity. There's no statement on shame on that. I want to take my family on awesome vacations. And there will be right times I will take my family on awesome vacations. But I'm doing it under the conviction of Jesus first with my finances. And if Jesus told me to lay all those things down and to give all my money away, I would. And you and I need to live with that same kind of heart. It's not an embarrassment that we have wealth. It's not a shame that we're Americans, but it's recognizing that we follow a different God. And last, I want to leave you with this. Generosity is the tangible proof of love, freedom, and renewal. Listen, this is what we have to get. When Jesus sets you free, you want to get generous. So let me say a very hard statement. If you have a hard time being generous, my conviction would be that somewhere inside of you, you're a slave to something. Because the generosity of Jesus, when the generosity of Jesus captivates our heart, it causes us to want to be radically generous. That's what it does. Freedom sets us free to be free people. I think all of us need to grow up in generosity. I more than almost anyone, but I would say this, when we experience the radical renewal of Jesus, it stirs something inside of us where we go, I want to be generous. Let me tell you another story. When I was a youth pastor, Emily and I lived in Seattle. I was a youth pastor, and there was a girl who was in our youth ministry that I loved a great deal, and she became an important person in our lives. Her dad was not really involved in her life. In fact, many of my conversations with her were about the hurt and the pain of her father's absence, and every once in a while, he would come in and just splash money around as his way of apologizing, but just for whatever reason, chose not to be the kind of man who was constantly in his daughter's life. And I went to her high school graduation. This was 2007. And I was sitting in her high school graduation next to her mom. Her dad wasn't there, didn't come. And just feeling the ache of that. And there on the other side of her graduation, we walk outside, and there's her dad waiting with a brand new yellow Toyota 4Runner, right? As this statement to his daughter. And she's so happy and so excited, and she's so thankful, and he gives her the keys, and she gets there, and she drives off. And then I go and I sit in my, I don't remember, 1993 purple Mercury Tracer, garbage can of a car. And I'm sitting in this car of mine. The AC doesn't work. The seats barely stay up. And I am filled with rage. I'm so mad at her dad. I'm so mad at her. I'm so mad at God. I'm like, God, this is so unfair. You are so unfair. Here I am trying to be a faithful person, and he shows up and just throws off money, and I know he's not even going to show up in the next year of her life. Here I am faithfully trying to serve you, and I'm driving around this garbage piece of a car, and this girl who's 18, who doesn't even have her driver's license, or only has her permit, now has this brand new beautiful car. I was filled with rage. I was filled with anger. I was filled with jealousy, and I was filled with greed. In that moment, I was like, this is not fair. God, you are not fair. And I remember sitting in that emotion. It was consuming me. And as I sat in the parking lot of this graduation, I realized I had to do something because the weight of this was too heavy. And if I didn't, it was going to negatively affect me. Because even at a young age, what I've always known is the condition of my heart matters more than anything else. So I remember I drove to a bank and I pulled out a few $100s and I wrote a card to her dad. And I thanked him for coming to her graduation. And I thanked him for showing lavish generosity. And I thanked him for loving his daughter on that day. And I asked him from the heart of a pastor to be more present in her life. And I told him how much it meant to me that he showed up that day and loved his daughter. And I just said, thank you. Because I knew that if I didn't care for the condition of my heart, if I didn't stand in an active stance of resistance, if I didn't put my own freedom on display, I was going to be a slave to something else. Friends, what we've got to realize, generosity is the tangible proof of love, freedom, and renewal. I love this quote by N.T. Wright. The kingdom that Jesus preached and lived was all about a glorious, uproarious, absurd generosity. Listen to that. The kingdom that Jesus preached and lived was all about a glorious, uproarious, absurd generosity. That generosity has now invaded inside of us and should come outside of us. People, when they meet us, should go, man, you want to know those people who go to the square? They are the most generous people. Like, you can hardly be around them without them giving you money. It's crazy. I don't know what to do with it, right? There's something about that. If we really tasted the kingdom of heaven, it would produce a radical generosity inside of us. I'm not saying don't be wise. Be wise. I'm not saying don't be a faithful steward. Be a faithful steward. I'm not saying don't have a savings account and plan for retirement. The reality is, in a Jewish culture, their retirement plan was their family. Our retirement plan is our retirement plan. It's a different world. It's okay that you take care of you and your family and your future. What is not okay is that you are more submitted to the heart of mammon than you are the heart of Jesus. What is not okay is that you're more in love with greed than you are with Jesus. What is not okay that you trust your bank account more than you trust Jesus. And for many of us, we need to take a step back and go, Father, would you do some heart surgery inside of me? Would you do some heart surgery inside of me? I don't want to be a slave to mammon. And I don't want you to be either. Linz, if you want to come up, we're going to close. I love, there's a story in Luke 19. This is the last thing that I'll share. About a man named Zacchaeus who encounters Jesus. And the passage is going to come up here on the screen. It says this out of Luke 19. It says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. We have to understand that for a Jewish man to be a chief tax collector meant he was a betrayer of his own people. He was hated among his people. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. I love that passage. You want to know why? Because it reminds me that Jesus loves to feast with sinners, which means he's willing to eat with me. He's willing to come to my house and find all of my garbage and all of my mess and all of my selfishness. He wants to be with me. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people began to mutter, he is gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times that amount. I love Zacchaeus' heart. He gets around Jesus and he gets consumed with him. And he goes, I've got to respond to this. I've got to do something about this. If you really are who that you say that you are, I've got to react to this. Jesus, I'm going to take all of my wealth and I'm going to give half it away. And everyone that I've cheated, which was everyone, I'm going to give back 4 times what I've taken from them. And Zacchaeus examples this extravagant response that you and I should follow in his steps. That when we get around Jesus, it makes us go, I want to give all my money. I want to be radically generous. I want to be faithful to you. God, what do I need to do? I need to respond. Friends, for too long, greed has had a grip on so many of us. No longer. And you know, I remember when I was young, I used to talk myself out of generosity because I made so little. I remember thinking, well, what's the point of tithing? My tithe is gonna be like $14. It's never been about the amount. It's always been about your heart. The reason we choose to give, whatever form it may be, is because we're living in active resistance to a culture of greed, that we know we need to protect our heart. My older brother married into a family of 5 daughters. And his wife, my sister-in-law's father, passed away of cancer maybe 18 years ago. And at the time, he was the only married-in brother-in-law, so he was the de facto son of the family. So he's helping his mother-in-law go through all of the finances and make sure that they were okay and figure out all of their expenses. And so my brother was there. He said he was sitting at the kitchen table of his father-in-law, this man named Ron Neve, who was an incredible man. And my brother talks about how as he started to look through their finances, he began to weep with a conviction he'd never had before. Because as he saw how his father spent money, he had no clue, one, how wealthy he was. He had no clue, two, how generous he was. And he had no clue, three, how much he didn't constrain himself to love other people. And I remember my brother telling me he sat at this kitchen table and he just thought, Jesus, I want to love people like this. I want one day when I'm gone, people to look at my checkbook and go, who was this man? What God did he serve that he gave like this? I want that to be the mark of our lives. That someone could say, you want to know what God he serves? Go look at his checkbook and you will find out. He serves a God named Jesus who is radically generous in all that he does. Friends, will you stand with me? I want to say this because I'm a feeler. So there it is. Feel convicted. Do not feel condemned. Feel challenged. Do not feel unworthy. All of us, compared to Jesus, fall so deeply short. May our heart be, when we get challenged by Jesus, to just come to him with grace and say, Father, will you help me? Father, will you help me? What would it look like for all of us just to take one step towards an active renewal of letting God have our finances, to building resistance that says, greed, you don't get to be my God anymore. I follow Jesus. Come on, let me pray. Lord, I love you with all of my heart. I thank you, Father, for what you're doing in our church, how you want to move within us. Would you meet us and minister to us here? Lord, anyone who just is wrestling with this today, would your Holy Spirit meet them with comfort and love and joy? God, come and move in our church. Come and cause us to be your people. In Jesus' name, amen.